Thank you for joining us here this evening for the University of New Mexico's 64th Annual Research Lecture. Tonight is about celebrating the significant achievements of distinguished Professor Scott Collins and to present him with this year's Annual Research Lecture Award. This is the highest honor for research and creativity that the UNM faculty can bestow on a colleague. And I want to emphasize that last part. This is an award bestowed by all of you who are faculty members to Scott Collins as research lecturer. It's not an award by the provost, by the president, or by anybody else who spends too much time in Scholes Hall. It's the highest honor in the sense that it comes from your colleague, Scott. Yeah, woo! The University of New Mexico is New Mexico's flagship university. We hold a Carnegie Very High Research Activity designation, and we are a Hispanic serving institution. Those designations are important as they reflect commitments that this university holds dear to both research excellence and to equity across all communities of identity. They also reflect the value that we place on our people and the extraordinary research they bring to this university. From discovering supermassive orbiting black holes to innovating next generation electronics, from the humanities to the social sciences to the creative arts, our research is incredibly diverse and truly excellent, generating knowledge that benefits all of us and this state. Distinguished Professor Collins exemplifies that excellence. For that, we thank you, Scott. Tonight, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce personally and to thank Distinguished Professor Collins for his contributions and leadership in making research at UNM outstanding. And I look forward to your lecture, Grasslands as Model Ecosystems. And with that, I would like to introduce and to welcome to the stage Dr. Alan Knapp, Distinguished Professor of Biology at Colorado State University, who will introduce our lecturer tonight. Professor Knapp.
Well, thank you, Provost Wood. It's an immense pleasure to be here. I was so happy when Scott asked me to introduce him for this award tonight. I was a little bit stunned that he entrusted me to do this, but I will try and do my best, Scott. I've known Scott for almost 30 years as a colleague and a friend. I originally thought I would get 30 minutes for this introduction in order to pay tribute to that time, but they've limited me to 5, so I have 5 minutes. I'll try and just give you the highlights. So I'll try and be as brief as I can. Let me begin with the essentials about Scott's background so you have a sense of where he came from. He did an undergraduate degree in biology from Wittenberg University in Ohio, a master's degree in botany from Miami University, also in Ohio, and then a PhD in botany from the University of Oklahoma. After his PhD, Scott did postdoctoral stints at the University of Vermont and at Rutgers before he was lured back to the University of Oklahoma, where he was a highly successful professor there for 10 years. After his 10 years there back in Norman, Oklahoma, he went to the National Science Foundation, where he was even a more successful program officer, overseeing the LTER program and many others there at the National Science Foundation. Then in 2003, as those of you who know, here on campus, he became a faculty member at the University of New Mexico, where he started as a professor of biology and since has been named the Loren Potter Chair in Plant Ecology. He's designated as a Regents Professor, and he has been named a University Distinguished Professor. Now, Scott's received many, many accolades and awards throughout his career, and I'll mention some of those at the end of my remarks tonight. And he's also been awarded quite literally millions of dollars to support his research over his career in competitive funding. But I want to spend a little more time talking about Scott's scholarly contributions, both here and in his earlier life as an NSF program officer and at the University of Oklahoma. Over his career, Scott has published well over 200 scientific papers. And I want to dive a bit deeper into the breadth of that contributions he's made to the field of ecology. Over 200 is impressive in its own right, but I spent a fair amount of time looking carefully at Scott's resume this weekend, and it's amazing the breadth, the taxonomic breadth, the disciplinary breadth, the habitat breadth that Scott's research has covered over the course of his career. He has published in ecosystems that range, studies in ecosystems that range from wetlands to arid lands, where he is today. He's published papers on microbes to mammals, insects to birds, grasses to trees, and he's had field sites literally around the globe from North America to South Africa. So his taxonomic diversity, habitat diversity is amazing. He's made tremendous contributions to his core field of plant community ecology, of which we'll hear more about that in a few minutes. But in partnerships with students and colleagues, he's also made contributions to a variety of other disciplines within the ecological sciences, including ecosystem ecology, restoration ecology, microbial ecology, ecophysiology, ecohydrology, sensor technology papers he has published, and even socio-ecological papers. Now, this range of research topics, right, is really impressive, and it demonstrates his collaborative nature. And indeed, in the audience here tonight, in the couple of first two rows here, there's a whole host. There's 20 or so of collaborators. Scott was kind enough to schedule this lecture at a time when he's currently collaborating with a group of scientists on a large international project looking at the effects of grazing in grasslands. So we're thankful for that, Scott, that you allowed us all to be here to celebrate with you tonight. And there's a reason why he's so collaborative. There's a reason why he's in demand as a collaborator. If I had to sum up Scott in one sentence, I would say this. Scott takes his science very seriously, but himself not so much. Scott is a lot of fun. Scott is in demand as a collaborator because he's very bright, he's very creative, he's very much fun to have around, but he's also scientifically very astute. And his contributions are really legendary in terms of his contributions to these working groups he's been involved in over his career. That helps explain this depth and breadth of his disciplinary contributions. Now, you might think that this broad diversity in topics and habitats and taxa that he's covered might actually dilute his scientific impact, but I think it's done just the opposite. Again, I spent a little bit of time delving into the kind of ways that people have cited and used Scott's research, and it's really quite impressive. In the last 5 years alone, Scott's papers have been cited by other scientists over 10,000 times. Now, for those of you doing the math in your head, that's 5 times a day, right, that Scott has been cited by other scholars in this field. To put it another way, depending on whether you're a night owl or not, by the time you go to bed tonight, 2 more people will have cited Scott in the scientific literature. That really is impressive, I think. Now, I could go on and on with many of his other scientific accomplishments. I could go on and on about the adventures we've had together, and adventures is a euphemism in this particular case. But I think I'll stop here, and instead let me just end with the final paragraph that I wrote in the letter supporting Scott for this particular award. And this is what I wrote. I said, a key criteria, according to this award, is that the UNM faculty member must have attained an exceptionally high level of success in their discipline. In addition to this research success and impact that I documented in the letter, I said additional evidence includes Scott being elected a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, a fellow of the Ecological Society of America. He's been elected president of the Ecological Society of America, and he's been awarded the Distinguished Service Citation from the Ecological Society of America. Now, for most of us, winning 1 or 2 of those awards would be enough. For those of you who are baseball fans, this is like hitting for the cycle, right? Scott essentially has won all 4 of these highly prestigious awards, and there's really no greater evidence of his impact and his success as an ecologist than I think winning all 4 of those. And so I finished by saying that UNM should feel exceedingly proud to have a scientist as successful as Dr. Scott Collins among their faculty ranks. And I think UNM does, because that's why we're here tonight, right? University of New Mexico is proud of Scott. His colleagues are proud of him, and we're very, very happy to hear from him tonight. So with no further ado, Scott, we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Okay, it's hard to live up to that. I'm sorry. I don't know, anyway. Thank you very much for being here. This is an amazing honor, and I really, really appreciate it. It means a lot. I've been interested in UNM for a very long time, and the second scientific paper I ever gave to a live audience was here in Albuquerque in about 1978 at the Southwestern Association of Naturalists meeting, the SWAN meetings, and it was a terrible talk. And hopefully none of you were there for that. I hopefully was the only one there to remember that. But I've interacted a lot with UNM people over the years. So I went from the University of Oklahoma to the National Science Foundation with the plans of being at NSF for 1 year. And like most people that go to NSF, Potomac fever hits hard. And you think it's pretty cool, like you're grading proposals instead of grading 203 exams, and you're having an impact on what's going on out there. Then while I was there, working at NSF, I was a colleague with Cliff Dahm, who was also a program officer at the time while his wife Rhea was running the Bureau of Mines in the Clinton administration. And I was also, my boss was Jim Gauze, who was a faculty member here for 35 years at least. And after Jim Gauze, my next boss eventually was Terry Yates, who was also here forever, from department assistant professor all the way up to vice provost of research. So I've really been influenced a lot by people from New Mexico throughout much of my career. And it's great to actually get a job and to be here, and I really appreciate it. To some extent, I feel like UNM, at least the biology department, was taking a bit of a risk. I had been at NSF for 10 and a half years or so, and it's a bureaucracy. It's not a research agency. It funds research, but basically it's a bureaucracy. And to some extent, many of my colleagues were wondering, am I some fat cat government bureaucrat looking to come here and retire in a nice place? And because of that fear that people felt like that, I think I may have overreacted to that and have worked just about as much as I possibly can to try to prove myself to them that I came here to get back into teaching, to get back into a research program, to interact with grad students, and interact with a lot of faculty colleagues. So I really appreciate everything that's happened here. I do need to do a little more history. So first of all, we have to have a slight musical theme. Forgive me for digressing a bit here, but there's a song by Leo Kottke that I'm particularly fond of, and it's not really that politically correct of a song, but nevertheless, I like it anyway. And he's singing a song to an ex-girlfriend and how his life turned out okay and everything like that. I'll just leave it at that if you don't know the song. But there's a particular line in it that really strikes me, and it strikes me because I have to dedicate this talk to Holly McLean, right? So Holly McLean was in the class of 1975, Wittenberg University, biology major just like me. And as like many undergraduates approaching the end of their biology undergrad degrees, I had absolutely no clue as to what was going to happen to me next. And so Holly McLean came up to me one day in the hallway, and she's like, "Scott, I'm going to graduate school at Miami University, and I'm going to study genetics." And she held up a reprint. So those of you that are over 50 know what that is, right? And she held up a reprint and said, "Look, I'm going to do stuff like this." And she said, "You should go to graduate school too." I had no idea what she was talking about. But I applied to Miami University anyway because Holly McLean told me to. And so I enrolled in the fall after my undergraduate graduation, and I got a job in the dish room because that's what I thought you did. And I was working in the dish room of the student union, having a good time. Occasionally good food comes down to the dish room. So for a grad student, that's an especially good treat. And I was working in the dish room and minding my own business. And then by the end of the first semester, Holly McLean hated graduate school. She hated graduate school and dropped out, and I got her TA. And so let's hope she's happy, because she sure deserves to be, especially for what she did for me. And here we are here tonight. All right. So Alan stole my thunder, but I have a couple of operating rules, and I think it's important. So she wasn't making that up. Right there, number one, take what you do seriously, don't take yourself seriously. And I think that's an important fundamental rule. And I try to live that rule regularly. But my other operating philosophy, rule number two, is be like T-Bone Burnett, as most of you probably feel the same way. T-Bone Burnett is a rock musician and producer. He's a very famous rock musician and producer. And one day I was listening to NPR, and they were interviewing T-Bone Burnett. And he was going on and talking about things, and then he said, when I get up on that stage, I'm the worst musician in the band. Because by surrounding myself with people that are better than me, it makes me a better musician. And I was like, that's it, man, that's it. I surround myself with wonderful collaborators, people that are better scientists than me, and I do better research because of that. And I feel much the same way as what his philosophy was really applies to the way we operate out here. And so I recommend that kind of philosophy as well. Surround yourself with people that are smarter, more talented, and better than you, and don't be intimidated by that, because everybody is going to benefit from it. I have to also thank the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. Much of my research career has been associated with the LTER network. And I'll say LTER because that's what we say in the biz. And it's a network funded by the National Science Foundation to promote long-term research. And there are a number of sites in the network that have been in existence for 20 to 30 years of long-term research. It's very unusual for the government to have that long of an attention span. And so we're really it's a remarkable program to begin with. And I started as a faculty member at the University of Oklahoma, and there weren't a lot of ecologists in the department there, but up the road at Kansas State, they had received one of the very first long-term ecological research awards for Konza Prairie. And so I started to drive up to Kansas and do research up at Konza Prairie, and I've been formally doing research up there since 1988. So it's an amazing site, and it's had a big impact on the kinds of things that I do and the development of collaboration. Because LTER is about integrative science. It's about multiple people and team science and thinking about lots of ways to address problems with various people. I got to come here from NSF to work in the Sevietta Long-Term Ecological Research Program. So UNM's long-term research project started in 1988 and has been funded ever since. And it was a privilege for me to come down here and be part of that Sevietta LTR. And so I've had a long-term relationship with the long-term research program, and it's been a big and a valuable part of the development of my research career. The other thing about NSF was, those of you that have been there, and like Tom and various people, maybe you've been a program officer, and so you go to NSF thinking, like, I'm an ecologist, I teach ecology, I know ecology. I just know the ecology, I know the discipline, but I'm going to learn how to write a really good proposal because I'm going to be at NSF. And so what you learn in about the first week you're there is that you don't know the breadth or depth of your discipline at all. And it's a fire hose of things that are sort of coming at you. And you never really do learn how to write a really good proposal because there are lots of ways to do that. But you really expand your horizons tremendously in what you see both within your discipline and how it links to other disciplines. And I think I benefited a ton from that. And it was a great experience for me to be at NSF and to sort of be exposed to so much more than I would have if I'd stayed in the botany department at the University of Oklahoma, which was also a place that was very good to me. And I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed my colleagues there. But NSF was like mind-bending. And so I think that has probably had some influence on how I've operated since I got out of NSF and the kinds of way I operate and the kinds of things I'm willing to try and do. You know, Alan talked about the breadth of this work. It's mostly because I just have a very short attention span. And so I don't have a lot of choice there. So I was emailing with Barbara McCready, who was last year's annual research award winner. And I said, you know, Barbara, I'm a little nervous. This is kind of nerve-wracking to do this. And she said, just show pictures of baby animals and you'll be fine. And I'm thinking she's a psychologist. She knows what she's talking about. So we get into the baby animal portion of the show. There's the first baby bison on Konza this year. I stole off Twitter. There's a baby kudu down in South Africa. A couple of baby hyenas. They're pretty cute. Baby elephants. Baby elephants are especially cute. And then some variously sized giraffes, just to entertain you there. All right. I don't know if that worked or not. Okay, so now that ends the easy listening portion of the program. And now we have to start talking about grasslands. All right. Grasslands as model ecosystems. What on earth do I mean by that? Grasslands are important. They're globally distributed. You can find lots of maps that show various distributions of grasslands. They occur on 6 of 7 continents. They don't occur in Antarctica yet. But I can promise you that the first identifiable vascular plant community in Antarctica will be a grassland, all right? And so they are globally important. Just wait and see, all right? But what's this model system stuff? So the cool thing about being at UNM is it's a biology department, right? And lots of institutions have split off, and cellular and molecular folks are in one department, and the ecology and evolution folks are in another department. And in my case, I'm lucky because I'm in a biology department where we are interacting together. And I've gotten to witness and even participate in searches from the cell molecular side of our department. And I'm always fascinated by the job descriptions. And so they have these big debates in faculty meetings, which you can imagine are pretty exciting, right? And there are debates like, well, we should get somebody that doesn't work on model systems. Or the next one would be, we need somebody that works with model systems. And now the latest search is somebody who works on emerging model systems. I don't even know what that means, right? All right, so I was like, cool, well, I can be like that too. I want to be like that. I want to be a model systems guy. So that's why I titled it, Grasslands as Model Ecosystems. All right? But the truth is, they're really important. They're really important ecologically. And they're also just sort of important globally. So they harbor tremendous amounts of biodiversity, right? Plants and animals, including a lot of charismatic biodiversity in many places. They sequester lots of carbon, at least some grasslands do. They're very important for carbon sequestration, and they're very important for food production, right? So globally, they're very important ecosystems to begin with, right? But are they model systems? Well, they actually have high biodiversity. A lot of that biodiversity sort of exists at a manageable spatial scale so that you can observe it and you can mess with it. You can do all kinds of experiments in the system, and most people don't care. Like if you want to mow it or burn it or dump fertilizer on it or put drought up shelters or dig holes in it, no one really cares, right? If you do that to like forests or more, charismatic ecosystems, people get upset with you if you go cut down all the trees or set them on fire and things like that, right? I mean, think about it. And so it's excellent for doing ecological experiments to test mechanisms and general theory. You get responses pretty rapidly in that system, so you can work on grasslands and get an answer in 5 or fewer years in many cases, where if you burn the forest, then you got a long time to wait to figure out what happened through your experimental approach. So they're really excellent systems to test ecological theory, and I think we can test a lot of theory in grasslands, and therefore I do think they are model ecosystems for ecological research. Hopefully I can convince you of that. So now let's talk about threats to grasslands. There are a lot of threats to grasslands, right? There's land use, lands management chain, there's fragmentation, there's invasive species, there's air pollution, there's changes in management regimes, all kinds of things that are happening in these ecosystems. The simplest explanation for all of them is the direct and indirect effects of people, okay? So we have to start thinking about that. And it's never been summed up better than POGO, right? We have met the enemy and he is us. I mean, that's what's going on here. And this is true for most ecosystems, not just grasslands, all right? So what I want to do today is I want to just talk about a little bit of the research that I've been involved in that addresses just a few of the threats to grasslands. So land use and land management. So how have we altered land management and disturbance regimes in grasslands? Eutrophication or air pollution. That's for the general audience. We're talking about nitrogen deposition for the rest of you guys out there, the ecologists in the room. And then, of course, climate change. We have to think about climate change and its impacts on these ecosystems. All right? And so I want to start with land use and management in a sort of a general context, and I want to go back to my Kanza days. So this is a little bit of a sort of a historical perspective on how I got started and the kinds of things I was thinking about and what Kanza Prairie was like for me as a scientist, all right? So Kanza Prairie is an amazing research area. It's a landscape scale experiment in which fire and grazing are manipulated on reasonable scales in which grazers can sort of do their normal thing. They're not in small pens, and fires can kind of move through this landscape. And this is a replicated landscape scale experiment. It's really cool. And so Kanza was started in 1980, and the first part of it was just to figure out what fire did to grasslands and fire frequency. And then from there, a herd of bison was reintroduced in the late 80s, and so they now combined fire and grazing. And on the east side of Kanza, the long-term ecological research program there's cattle grazing. So you can compare the ecological impacts of cattle versus bison in tallgrass prairie ecosystems. So it's an incredibly cool place. It is in northeastern Kansas. There is topography there, unlike what you think with the Wizard of Oz. And there are all kinds of disturbances and things that take place in these ecosystems. So grasslands are essentially disturbance-generated ecosystems. And many of these mesic grasslands that grow in wetter areas, are actually in a climate that could support and grow forests. And so to maintain vegetation like this, tallgrass prairie, you have to have high fire frequency to keep trees from taking over these landscapes. So fire frequency is an important controller of grassland ecosystems. And now the question is, how frequently do we need to burn in order to maintain tallgrass prairie as tallgrass prairie? And that's one of the questions that we can ask and answer through this long-term research program at Kanza Prairie. All right. And so this really reflects how we manage grasslands, how we manage them for conservation or how we manage them for beef production. All right. And so there's some real practical applications for some of this work here that's done at Kanza. The experimental design is primarily today's management design. It's not, there's sort of what was historical fire frequency like, but a lot of the burning is done in the spring, which is when the regional fires take place as a management tool to generate grass for cattle production in the Flint Hills region of Kansas. All right. And so a few years ago, we tried to just summarize some general patterns of importance with regard to fire frequency. So you need high fire frequency to maintain tallgrass prairie in this ecosystem, all right? And so what we find is, so these are the graphs, like I said, this is going to be the tougher part of the talk here. So we have number of times a watershed has been burned on this axis, and I'm going to primarily talk a lot about either the abundance or the richness of species out there. So how much biomass or how much plant growth is there of certain categories. So the big dominant things that are out in that landscape are the C4 grasses. These are the things that animals like to eat. That's the dominant thing. That's why it's called tallgrass prairie, because it's full of tall grasses. And the more frequently you burn, the more tall grasses you get in that ecosystem. And as a consequence, then other functional types like C3 grasses or forbs, the little flowery things that bring biodiversity and make the place pretty, they decline. So you need high fire frequency in order to maintain tallgrass prairie, but as you do that, you drive down biodiversity and you just promote the growth of grasses under these management regimes. All right. And this is work I did with a former master's student of mine, Laura Calabrese, who's now teaching in Next Gen Academy here in Albuquerque Public Schools. But what we found also is if you look at the number of times burned and species diversity on this axis, and here's the annual burning. So diversity declines with annual burning, and this is annual burning with bison grazing. And we have no net loss of biodiversity out there. And so all we need to do to manage biodiversity in these ecosystems is sort of figure out the right fire frequency out there and combine that with a certain level of grazing. That grazing is actually good in these ecosystems. It's a combination of their natural disturbance regime, which we can use to manage tallgrass prairies for biodiversity. And if you can manage biodiversity of plants, you can enhance biodiversity of grasshoppers and insects and pollinators, right? So there's some knock-on effects to that. And so we figured this out, that this was an important combination of factors to maintain biodiversity. And I'm pleased to say that this information is now and was used, and it has been used, to manage tallgrass prairie preserves, like the Narrow Bear Preserve in Nebraska and some preserves in Kansas. So they took this information and used this now as a way to attract people. Bison are cool, people like to see bison, and to also maintain and manage tallgrass prairie. So I consider this outcome from Kanza to be kind of fun science. It's a way to promote natural disturbance regimes. It's a way to say that grazing is actually okay, because at the beginning of the Clinton administration, when Babbitt was appointed to be Interior Secretary, the catchphrase of the day was grazing free in '93. We're going to get grazing off of all federal lands. And in a lot of places, that's just a really bad idea, that these lands are, these ecosystems have grazing as a natural disturbance. It's built into those systems. All right. And so we've just sort of worked out the general patterns out here. We know we can interact with fire and grazing. So if you burn a grassland, you make it all grassy, which attracts the bison, right? So there's a positive impact on grazing, all right? And that is going to have a negative impact on the C4 grasses, because you graze them down, which increases the biodiversity of forbs. And so we just worked out this simple model about the dynamics of the forbs and the grasses and fire and grazing in these ecosystems. And it can be sort of used as in a management context, or it can just be something you could show with a pretty grassland in the background. I mean, look at that. How can you not love grasslands, right? All right. We've also done some other things because of fire frequency, and this is work with Zach Radizak, who got his PhD with Jesse's here somewhere, at Kansas State, and has been doing a postdoc and is going back to be a faculty member at K-State. And And Zach is really interested in a phenomenon called alternate stable states, where you have sort of like two different kinds of ecosystems that can exist in the same conditions. And what we sort of think about in Kanza and in grasslands in general is that you can have a grass ecosystem or you can have a woody plant ecosystem, and it's a function of fire frequency. And in the absence of fires, shrub cover just takes over in these ecosystems, right? So fire is essential. It's essential to maintain tallgrass prairie. Otherwise, we switch it to a completely different ecosystem type. And this is a phenomenon that's occurring globally. This woody plant encroachment into grasslands is a global phenomenon through a number of factors associated with grazing management, fire management, and elevated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the combination of a number of factors. So, what that means is basically this. Smokey Bison says, start more fires, only you can prevent forests, right? Okay, so just keep that in mind. And so the Kanza thing was pretty cool because it sort of led to an additional research project. Kanza was very well known in grasslands for its fire and grazing research. And the Kanza group was invited to South Africa, in Kruger Park, South Africa, to take advantage of a long-term fire experiment that had been started in the park in the 1950s. And they've been burning 7-hectare patches of grassland throughout the park since the 1950s at different fire frequencies. Some were burned every year, some every 3 years, some were fire was kept out of. And so it's a comparable system to Kanza Prairie. And so we were intrigued by that. So can we go down there? Is everything we've learned about Kanza, does it just belong to Kanza, right? Or can we generalize? That was one of the big questions. And it was a risky question to kind of go after. And this is a project with lots of collaborators from Kanza. There you see Alan Knapp and Mendy Smith and John Blair at K-State, and Sally, a former student of mine who's now a professor at UNC Greensboro and is here in the audience, and Kevin, who's also here in the audience, right? Because we have this grazing thing going on down there. And Kevin Kirkman, who's the South African that keeps us reasonable from our, sort of interpretation of what South African grasslands are doing. All right. And so we got to go to Kruger and do this comparative research project down there. And so we had to design it so that we measured things in exactly the same way at both sites. Because the South Africans were convinced that Southern Hemisphere grasslands were just fundamentally different than Northern Hemisphere grasslands, and they operated under different principles. And so the only way to really test whether or not they're right was to actually do the experiment at the same time in the same way in these comparable systems out here, right? And so these are the experimental burn plots that are scattered through Kruger Park. It's one of the most charismatic parks in the world, which is why there are pictures of giraffes scattered around campus now associated with this presentation. And so we took advantage of a set of these plots in a grassy part of Kruger, and have been working there since, the Kanza folks have been there since the early 2000s. I've been working there since 2005 down at Kruger. All right. And so we have data, all right? So a big question is, right, how similar are these ecosystems and the way they respond? And so if you just sort of focus right here, this is one of my favorite graphs of all of this project, okay? So here's time on this axis, and this is the difference in plant species diversity between a grazed patch and an ungrazed patch, essentially, right? And the 3 lines are for 3 different fire frequencies at Kanza, so that says Kanza right there. And so what that shows is if you put up those grazing exclosures in an area that has been grazed by bison, plant species diversity crashes. In other words, those bison really do get a gold star for biodiversity conservation because it's that grazing that is keeping diversity high in that ecosystem. In Kruger, we didn't get that response. It responded very, very differently. And so there tells you there's something fundamentally different about the components of these ecosystems. And one of those main differences is the types of grasses that occur in South Africa and their evolutionary history. So the reason we didn't see this decline is because there is a grass down there that's not palatable, and it covers a lot of the landscape. It's called stinky grass, right? And the animals don't like it. The animals hate stinky grass, so they eat all the good grass, leaving stinky grass behind, which means stinky grass can expand. So that kind of begs the question, why isn't the entire park covered in stinky grass, right? Because there are all these animals out there eating the good stuff. Well, we had the opportunity to witness a tragedy in a sense, in that there was an incredible drought in South Africa in 2015 and 16. one of the worst droughts on record. And that drought was sort of the epicenter of that drought was around Kruger Park. And productivity went to zero in many places. Lots of animals died. Water holes dried up. And it was stunning to see this. It was very difficult to see this like play out in front of us. But what we were able to do with our collaborators who've been thinking about this place is that we realized that this could be an important ecological opportunity. This could be the important event. Because we have to figure out why stinky grass isn't everywhere. And it could be because stinky grass doesn't do well in drought. And the animals have to eat everything when it's just hay like that. And we predicted that the good grasses would come back faster than the stinky grass, and we would witness the expansion of a palatable landscape out there that would appear much more rapidly than the animal populations could rebuild, right? And so we have this theory, beautifully drawn theory right there, which says basically that. And it's sort of arguing that fire frequency is going to matter, but we're going to see the palatable grasses come back super fast after this big drought. And we have a couple of years of data. This is just the first year of data. This is stinky grass before the drought. This is stinky grass after the drought. And here's a palatable grass increasing on both annually burned and 3-year burns. And you don't see that much of a change in the infrequently burned watersheds. So again, fire interacting with drought is going to have a positive impact on the abundance of the forage grasses out there, the edible grasses in this ecosystem. So despite the fact that it's hard to see a lot of starving animals and carcasses out there, there are some important outcomes of events, extreme events like this, that actually reset these ecosystems and are probably fundamentally important. The question now is, how frequently will this occur? This is an unusual event today. When will this become more of a usual event, and will the recovery times exist between the particular extreme events that occur out there? All right. So that's going back to grasslands and management and fire and biodiversity. I want to talk a little bit about a different project now about nitrogen deposition, air pollution, and its impacts on biodiversity, or its potential impacts on biodiversity. And it's a different collaboration. But this is a map showing a flat Earth. And on the flat Earth, there are blobs across it, and those blobs represent the amount of nitrogen that is falling out of the atmosphere into whatever ecosystem is down underneath it, okay? So we have greatly increased the amount of available nitrogen on this planet. We are flooding and polluting the planet. And so a lot of ecosystems that have been typically starved of nitrogen in the past are getting fertilized by atmospheric deposition when it rains or just dry deposition out there. And it's happening globally. And so just a quick look at what nitrogen and fire can do at Konza Prairie is that this is diverse species richness in sort of in a burned or a control plot. And this is species richness. If you burn it every year and throw some nitrogen on it, species richness disappears. It crashes. It has a huge negative impact, fire plus nitrogen. And yet, if you throw those, this isn't in case it's a mower, but if you were to throw something like a bison out there, you can actually counteract that effect. Again, so grazing is a fundamentally important thing to reduce this dramatic decrease in species richness and biodiversity that would occur if we continue to pollute the air and have that nitrogen fall on these ecosystems, and then we burn them to keep the trees out all the time. All right? And so we then expanded our work and looked at a bunch of LTER sites that had nitrogen fertilizer experiments. And so here we talk about the production response. So not surprisingly, many of you that have houseplants, if you fertilize a garden, if you fertilize it, the plants grow more, okay? So we can demonstrate that ecologically that happens in natural systems as well. And so they grow more, and the production response increases with the ecosystem's productive capability. And as the production goes up, biodiversity goes down. Very simple relationship. The more production goes up, the more biodiversity goes down, right? So we can see that across sites in multiple experiments. So we can find some generality here. And so we had this expanded group of people led by Sam Simpkin, who is a postdoc up at UC Boulder, and Katie Suding was involved in this project as well, in which we got about 11,000 data sets or plots of data. And we were able to look at the nitrogen deposition map and sample across gradients of nitrogen deposition in different regions here in the US, and then essentially map out through statistical shenanigans what we would think of as the critical load of nitrogen for a given ecosystem. So when you fertilize nutrient-poor systems, diversity goes up to a point, and then you reach a value where it drops off after that, and that value is a critical load. And this has fundamental importance for EPA's air quality regulations, right? This is work done with scientists from the EPA, and they want to use this information for developing critical loads and essentially regulating air pollution and nitrogen pollution in the atmosphere. And so this is kind of fun to do kind of cool like this and apply some ecology knowledge to some information that's valuable. We were also able to pull out of that data set, and this is Chris Clark, who I started working with when he was a young grad student at the University of Minnesota, and he's now a climate change scientist with the EPA in DC, bless his heart, and he's hanging on. But he led this effort, and this is a really ugly graph, but it doesn't matter. What it shows is that we are able to actually provide a critical load for 348 herbaceous plant species growing across the United States that can be used as indicator species for air pollution and understanding the dynamics of air pollution in herbaceous communities. So this is a fun project. This was a fun project as well. It's brand new. This paper's just not quite come out yet. All right? And so now climate change. We have to get to the good story, right? Because we're all into climate change. Okay, and that'll bring me starting at least to the Sevieta and bring me here to New Mexico. So here we have the Middle Rio Grande Valley, Albuquerque up here, the Sevieta down there, the Sevieta National Wildlife Refuge. And I want to sort of think about climate change and certain things that climate is going to do to us in this region and talk a little bit about how that helps us decide what science to do and then whether or not we can expand that again to very large spatial scales. All right? And so the Sevieta, again, it's grassland, you gotta love it, all right? And it's fortunate that the Sevieta just happens to be located as a wildlife refuge at a bunch of ecotones, at the borders of major ecosystems. So we can see Great Plains grassland that extends into Colorado. We can see Chihuahuan desert grassland that extends south into Mexico. And the boundary for those grasslands is right here at the Sevieta. And crawling along behind black grama is creosote. Creosote is very gradually expanding its range northward and converting grasslands into shrubland in this ecosystem as well. So how much of this is a function of climate change, right? And how will climate change affect these ecosystems and the rate of change? If you're at a range boundary, then you're really at a physiological limit, so those individuals of the species in that area are likely to be most sensitive to variability, right? Because they're right at their range boundaries, right? So it's a great place to think about ecosystem transitions and climate change, all right? So the stars of the show are blue grama, which is one of the most important forage grasses in North America, black grama, which is a Chihuahuan desert grass, and creosote bush. And we have evidence that black grama is taking over that ecosystem at a much greater rate than blue grama is out there. So we see an expansion, essentially, of the Chihuahuan desert ecosystem into the middle part of the state, which is consistent with a more arid environment as a function of climate change, all right? So this is what's predicted in the future, okay? And the southwestern US is shown here. The probability of decadal drought is about 100%. And the probability of multi-decadal droughts is close to 90% at the end of this century. Decadal-long extreme drought, 90% probability that that's going to happen. That's what the future is in the Southwest and in the Great Plains, where the grassland regions are. All right. In addition, climate modelers have decided that they're going to see a significant impact on the monsoon, the start and the stop of the monsoon. So the monsoon season, we're going to see a decline in rain early in the monsoon season and an increase later. In other words, the monsoon season is going to shift to later in the growing season, leaving us a longer hyper-arid period between the spring rains and the summer monsoons. So how will that affect these ecosystems if you make it drier and hotter for longer every year? All right. And so I'm involved in a cross-site experiment called EDGE. It's the Extreme Drought in Grasslands experiment. And it's at 6 sites across the Great Plains, including 2 sites at the Sevieta, a site outside of Fort Collins, a site in southern Wyoming, a site in central Kansas, which is more mixed grass prairie, and then a site at eastern Kansas, the tall grass prairie at Konza. So we have this same experiment replicated across this grassland region. And the question is, how sensitive are these ecosystems to drought? We're going to treat them all the same way. And we would predict that the mesic ecosystems that are used to water are going to be the most sensitive, and these dry ecosystems that are used to being dry aren't going to care about this drought, right? And they're not going to respond much to this drought. All right. And again, this is a project with good colleagues, Alan Knapp, who you've met, and Mendy again, Ichi Liu over here, and biology department chair and colleague Will Pockman, who's rather shy. All right. So, all right. And the Sevieta group also includes Jen Rudgers and Lauren Bauer, who's the project manager for the LTR site, and some grad students and colleagues here as well that helped me actually analyze data and make sense of all the stuff that we've been doing out there. So again, a nice collaborative project. All right. So here are the predictions. Change in monsoon, big drought. So we put up rainout shelters. We remove 66% of the growing season rainfall. We create a drought right under that rainout shelter. Put up about 10 of those. You got an experiment. People think you're cool, right? Over here, we have a rainout shelter. We put plastic on the roof for 2 months, July and August, capture all the rain that falls on that shelter, store it in tanks, take the roofs off in September, and sprinkle that water back on there. And by gosh, we've moved the monsoon season later in the year, right? So we experimentally trick out the system with rainfall like that. And so there's the edge, blue grama ecosystem, and we do this in the black grama ecosystem down there at the Sevieta. And the plots are all pretty cool looking. There's like wires and sensors everywhere, so we can actually monitor all kinds of responses to these chronic droughts. And here's the data from our 2 sites, the edge blue, edge black, and this is the dominant species, right? Blue grama here, black grama there. Within 2 to 3 years, both of the dominant species have completely tanked under this drought. They're not tolerant of this drought at all. They are suffering enormously under this drought. So what does that say about the future? All right. Here's the 6-site comparison. So this is pre-treatment. You can sort of see where the abundance of the treatment was relative to the control. And here's the black grama site. So black grama has gone way down. Blue grama and black grama way down at the blue grama site. Blue grama going down in Colorado. And a little less response, much less sensitive response in the mesic ecosystems that are supposed to suffer enormously when you drought them. All right, so this is why we do research, okay? Because we don't actually know all the answers, no matter how smart we think we are, right? Okay, and so that leads me to the idea about sensitivity. How sensitive are ecosystems to climate variability? And so this is a paper that was published in 2004 by Huxman et al. And a number of the authors of this paper are here in the audience. And it's a very influential paper. And it has a lot of cool information in it, right? And so this is the graph to really pay attention to for the moment. And what this shows is we have precipitation, mean annual precipitation here. So if you go to a site, there's an average rainfall for the past 30 years. You give it that mean annual precipitation, that's your x-axis. And then this axis is going to be net primary production, or how much the plants grow when it rains, okay? And so what we see is that as you look across all of these sites, net primary production increases with precipitation, all right? That's not a big surprise, okay? And it starts to level off as you get to more and more precipitation, higher precipitation. It starts to level off because other elements are limiting primary production. Water isn't the limiting factor. All right, so that's across the sites. Now, each one of these little lines is how much production changes from year to year as rainfall changes from year to year, right? And so if the line is flat, that means the system doesn't care. Rainfall goes up and down, you get the same amount of production, right? It's less sensitive to variability or natural variability in precipitation over the time interval of that data set. But when you come down at the lower end of the gradient, lower mean annual precipitation, you start to see a lot more steeper slopes. So these ecosystems, these are the ones that are sensitive to interannual variation in precipitation, interannual variability in climate. It's the grasslands that are very sensitive, okay? It's nice, all right? And so if you graph the slopes of these lines against mean annual precipitation, you get this sensitivity graph. It shows you that there's a nonlinear response to sensitivity across a precipitation gradient and across ecosystems from grasslands to tropical forests, all right? So let's talk about NEON. NEON is the National Ecological Observatory Network. And NEON is all about big bucks and big stuff. It is essentially the massive investment in ecology by the National Science Foundation. $450 million to build it, and they're going to give it $65 million a year for the next 30 years. And if you add up all that, it's over $2 billion being invested in this observatory network for ecologists, all right? And so one of the things that NEON has done is it has divided up the US into biophysical zones, right? They're called domains. And these domains are defined by a number of variables, and they're actually really well defined ecologically, okay? And so NEON is distributed across this zone, within each of these zones and across the continental United States, all right? So NEON's the big gorilla in ecology, and we have to take it seriously, okay, because of its investment. But we can always ask whether or not, the thought process for the development of NEON is very logical, and what is the fundamental thing that NEON can do for us across this spatial scale for $2 billion, right? So we used a bunch of data that exist thanks to the federal government. The Historical Climate Network has 1,218 US climate stations that have data that extend for about 100 years, all right? And the government has been popping satellites into space, and it's great for looking at ecosystems because you can measure productivity from satellites now, which is cool because that can expand the spatial scale and the frequency with which you can analyze data. So we've combined the climate variability measurements with NDVI measurements of net primary production, and we're saying that NDVI is a surrogate for primary production, and there's literature to say that that's actually true. And then we calculate trends in aridity across the US, NPP responses, and see how these ecosystems respond to climate change. So we're going to move up in scale here. All right, and this is work that's going on with a postdoc here at UNM, and Alicia Hallmark's a grad student, and Renee Brown, who's everything from a grad student to a staff person to a data manager, an information manager. And Osvaldo Sala, a good friend of mine at Arizona State University, who actually interviewed for the job I got. Right? So we're still good friends, okay? All right, and so this is what we can produce. So there's the Huxman graph right there, and this is our graph across all the NEON domains with 1,216 data points versus 14 data points here, right? So we can fill in those ecosystems, and we can expand our summary of the variability of ecosystems across productivity gradients. And we can even reproduce the one negative slide. This is an Atlantic neotropical forest. And the wetter it is, the less it grows because there's not enough sunlight, right? When it rains too much, all right? And so we have been able to regenerate that at the NEON domain scale, okay? And there's a reproducibility challenge in science today where people are concerned that a lot of stuff can't be reproduced. And we have used completely different data from different time frames, and we can actually reproduce and enhance the results from this earlier study, right? We can then recreate this part of the figure here, the sensitivity figure, and we sort of generate the same patterns there. We can see that sensitivity changes with net primary production in a nonlinear fashion. But having the data available at this spatial scale allows us to do something that couldn't be done with those earlier analyses. What our data have done and have demonstrated beautifully is the red-blue divide in this country, right? So what we've done is we've mapped sensitivity of ecosystems across all of those climate stations and then expanded that, extrapolated between them. And so the ecosystems that are the most sensitive to climate variability over that 16 or 17 year are the Great Plains grasslands rule, and southwestern arid ecosystems. Those are the most sensitive to climate variability, right? Over here, it's getting boring, right? It's not that interesting over there, but the sensitivity is very low over in that ecosystem out there. And it's also low over here where it rains a lot. Okay, we then looked at just the data from those data points and calculated an index of aridity, right? We combined temperature and precipitation to get an idea about how dry the place is. It's a dryness index, all right? And where is aridity changing at the continental scale in the southwestern and western US? It's getting drier out here in the west. Aridity is increasing. It's not getting drier in the east. It's getting more mesic, right? It's getting wetter there. And from that, we then looked at variability, temporal variability. Climate is supposed to get more variable under climate change. So here's our variability index. And where is it most variable? It's out here in the west. That's where the climate is most variable. Here in the east, It's not even more variable, it's less variable. So it's wetter and less variable, it's boring for ecology. If you want to do cool ecological research under climate change, work in the West. That's where it's happening. There's a lot happening out here, okay? And so given this information, we have to start asking some questions here about neon and what this means. So far, we're talked about sensitivity based on existing data sets, right, of how much an ecosystem has increased or decreased in response to annual changes in precipitation. But at some point where we see changes in the western US, where the average is getting drier and the variability is getting larger, we have to start to ask, when does sensitivity start to reflect vulnerability? When will these ecosystems be pushed to an extent that they can't recover? Remember, blue grama and black grama, our foundation grasses down at the Sevietta, tanked after 3 years of chronic drought. What does that tell us about what the future is like? And to me, an investment like NEON needs to take this kind of question and spread that across the domains and across the continental United States to have sort of a major focus for what we are going to invest another $2 billion in the next 30 years. So with that, I got to thank people. I want to thank my mentors. Paul Risser was my PhD advisor. He was the vice president for research here. Shortly after that, I drove him out of academics in a way. And Frances James was just wonderful to me. She was really the person that helped me design my PhD research, took me out in the field, showed me how to do stuff, and she was just darn right nice to me. And so those two people had a huge influence on the start of my life, and I think they deserve a thanks. I want to thank my students, collaborators, and they start off as students, but rapidly within 6 months to a year, they're just collaborators. I learn as much from them as they learn from me, for sure. And so this is all part of this sort of collaborative environment. I want to thank my wife, Nancy, for putting up with me, but I don't really need to say that because she's actually more obsessed with academic life than I am. She's a professor at Arizona State University. But she's been great and very supportive of a lot of things I've been doing. You got to thank the funding agencies. They have been generous. It's overwhelming to think about the amount of money I've been able to get with my colleagues. I can't do this alone. This award belongs to all these people. It doesn't belong to me. I'm just up here behind the microphone. But it's a collaborative effort, and it's a collaborative award that I appreciate. I appreciate UNM Biology for taking the risk, bringing me out of NSF, and giving me the opportunity to interact with great colleagues. UNM for this wonderful honor, my faculty colleagues, I greatly appreciate it. It means a lot to me. And I got to thank you for coming here tonight and for listening. Thank you.
We'll take some questions, and I also believe that there is a microphone. The microphone is there. So we're you might have noticed we're taping this, so we'll run the microphone around for your questions. We'll stand out of the way. Where's the questions?
Okay, I guess it's time for refreshments. Hi, Dave.
So have we had any period of 3 years of drought in the past 100 years, and has it not destroyed all of blue and black grama?
Yeah, we have. I mean, I think the great drought of the 30s was pretty significant. Recovery times, occurred pretty rapidly, but it's a completely different climate regime than it is now. So.
Scott.
Hi, Diana.
Can you talk more about why you hypothesized that stinky grass would not be able to recover after these large-scale drought events, or what about stinky grass is different than the palatable grasses?
So it was a wild guess in some extent, but to some extent, but I mean, there's got to be a trade-off. There's got to be a trade-off in various traits that species have because they have a limited amount of energy to sort of to allocate to various things. They're putting a lot of energy into making this these compounds that they store that make it stink and make it taste bad. And so perhaps it's just a function of that trait. Some grasses just aren't very good about surviving drought anyway. And so, we were just guessing that this might be the big event that was happening out there. I mean, the animals had to eat it. There was nothing out there but hay. They had to eat everything. And so it's probably not very tolerant of grazing, even if it's, out in that ecosystem, right? Because it's trying to prevent itself from being eaten. So we figured it was going to be probably a dramatic response to this thing. And so far we're right. The 2 years of data we haven't processed yet show a lot of grass recovering, and not just the Eurocloa, which is sort of an early short-lived but palatable grass, but some of the other longer-lived palatable grasses are increasing pretty rapidly at the expense of stinky grass.
So this is actually not about your research, I think, but I think you're an expert on something I've always wondered about as a New Mexican. I grew up here, and all those kind of semi-arid places that are full of creosote and sagebrush, and I've always been told that those were once these incredibly rich grasslands that were overgrazed and now look like what they do. Is that true, and does that tell us anything about what to expect under climate change, or is it a completely different causal story about grade?
So the estimates are in the literature that about 20 million hectares of grassland has been converted to shrubland throughout the Southwest. So both creosote and mesquite are increasing rather dramatically over the past 150 years. And it's estimated that one of the major drivers of that historically was overgrazing. The people that came here to graze came here with Eastern productive sort of mindsets about how you stock and run cattle in these ecosystems. And so they degraded those ecosystems pretty rapidly. And there's pretty good evidence that once you get an expansion of these shrubs, then it just propels itself at that point. It's going to continue across the landscape. Right now, we don't see a lot of advancement of the shrub front down at the Sevietta. It's not grazed, so that tells you something. But there's interesting evidence now that the future of shrub encroachment will be carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because there's some experimental evidence to suggest the shrubs, which are C3 species, gang, are benefiting from this flooding the atmosphere of CO2, and it's not going to benefit the grasses, which are C4 species. C4 photosynthesis evolved under low carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's an adaptation to low CO2, and we have just pulled the rug out from under that adaptation, right? And so it's likely that different mechanisms will play out over time with regard to shrub encroachment. And you combine that with a drought that's going to weaken grass cover, then we could see pulses of shrubs expanding across these landscapes. And what we've learned from shrubs down there at the Sevietta is that the wintertime temperatures in the shrubland are 2 degrees centigrade warmer than in the grassland. So these shrubs actually create a microclimate that benefits their expansion. And if you surround a city like Albuquerque with creosote, it's going to be 2 degrees centigrade warmer here in the winter than it would be otherwise. And if you add 2 degrees centigrade of climate change on top of that, it's going to be warm here in the wintertime, right? And so these landscape scale changes have potential consequences, lots of interesting consequences. Yeah. All right.
Hey, Scott. Along those lines with the last question he asked, as far as the encroachment of later to the Laretri and Tata creosote, how's that noticeable on what time of, which type of time scale is that noticeable long term? And how is that being measured? You talk about this encroachment of the shrubland, sort of moving northward. Mm-hmm. So I was just curious. I mean, I've been there for 2 years, and obviously I haven't noticed it myself.
Right.
But I was just wondering.
Yeah, so it's through historical photos. There are photo points where people have taken photos like in the early 1900s and again later today, and you see this massive increase in shrubs. So you know that it's actually occurred there. At the Jornada Long-Term Ecological Research Site in southern New Mexico, that was at the Agricultural Research Service range site down there, and they had black gramma grassland, and they put permanent plots in that grassland and sampled those permanent plots over the last 100 years, and some of those grassland plots became dominated by creosote bush, so that you can actually witness this transformation that's happening. But it's uncertain how much further it's going to go. I predict that the capability of creosote to expand further is there, but I don't think it'll get up on the plateau because creosote hates cold, and I think it will still be cold enough winters to make it difficult for creosote to sort of get up up around Santa Fe. But it could expand quite a bit north and surround a lot of those grasslands that surround Albuquerque, I think. And I think I'm the only person that thinks this, as far as I know, but that creosote was farther up north. It was much more expansive than it was today when we went through the warm phase, the post-glacial warm phase, and then we went through a little ice age, and I think it went racing back, and now it's just bouncing along again through those climate cycles. Just a guess. But there's creosote at Isleta. There's supposedly some creosote patch up on the airbase somewhere over by the mountains. So it's around out there. Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. I realize I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Trish Henning. I'm Professor of Physics and Astronomy and Associate Vice President for Research. And my office is absolutely delighted to support this award in tonight's festivities. Thank you, distinguished Professor Collins, Scott, for a fascinating and entertaining lecture. Your research is vital to scientific understanding of these ecosystems, which are feeling the impact of climate change and other human factors. We have a need to have a real understanding of the ramifications of human activity, and scientists like yourself need to continue finding the truth and telling us about it. This work has societal impact, and we are all grateful for what you do. We're also grateful for the influence you have on your students and the fantastic training that you've been doing to produce the next generation of scientists in the field. Education and research are not separate things. They're not separate endeavors. And the experiences that are possible here for students are part of what makes UNM a special place. I would also like to recognize the members of the UNM Faculty Senate Research Policy Committee who did a thoughtful job and an excellent job selecting tonight's lecturer, as they do every year. Finally, I want to thank the OVPR staff for their hard work in organizing tonight's event. And now it's time for the award, which we need to do not behind the plant. So I'd like you to come forward and accept this award in recognition of your extraordinary work, your contributions to science and to the University of New Mexico.
Thank you.
We get out from underneath the pole.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you. All right, thanks. That's great. I appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Yes.
I want to thank the VPR staff, too, who did a lot to prepare for this, and they were so patient with me. And I think they did a great job, and thanks to those folks as well.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to all of you for coming. And now we have a nice reception, which is just down the hall in Stam Commons. So if you go out the door and turn right, it will be on your left, not very far. So thank you, everybody, for coming.